In the summer of 1260, the most feared empire the world had ever known marched toward Egypt. They had ravaged Baghdad. They had drowned the Tigris in blood and ink. They had extinguished the light of 500 years of Islamic wisdom in barely a week. Now they advanced southward, convinced that no force on earth could stop them. But in the hills of Galilee, beside a spring the ancients called the Spring of Goliath, something awaited them. It was not fear, it was not surrender. It was an army of slaves turned warriors, led by a sultan who had sworn to defend the last bastion of Islam, even if it cost him his life. And when both forces clashed in that narrow valley, the world held its breath. Arrows darkened the sky, sabers gleamed under the scorching sun, war cries mingled with the thunder of hooves. A Mongol general who had never known defeat fell from his horse. And when the dust finally settled over Ain Jalut, the legend of Mongol invincibility lay shattered among the bodies. For the first time in 40 years of unstoppable conquests, the empire had been defeated, and the echo of that morning would forever change the course of history. To understand what happened at Ain Jalut, one must go back 2 years, to the moment when the Islamic world witnessed the end of its golden age. In February of 1258, the Mongol army under the command of Hulagu Khan, grandson of Genghis Khan, arrived at the gates of Baghdad. The city had been for 5 centuries the beating heart of Islam. Its libraries contained the accumulated knowledge of humanity. Its palaces gleamed with gold and marble. Its scholars had preserved and expanded the heritage of Greece, Persia, and India. It was, without question, one of the most magnificent cities on earth. Caliph al-Mustasim, confident in divine protection and in walls that had withstood centuries of sieges, rejected the demand for surrender. It was a fatal error. The Mongols surrounded the city from all flanks. Chinese engineers operated the catapults that hurled stones against the ancient walls. Cavalry from the steppes cut off every escape route. In barely 12 days, Baghdad fell. What followed was a massacre the Arab world would never forget. For an entire week, the Mongols looted, burned, and killed without mercy. Historians estimate that between 200,000 and 1 million people perished. The libraries were destroyed. The manuscripts, the intellectual treasure of generations, were thrown into the Tigris River. It is said the waters ran black with ink for days and red with blood for weeks. The House of Wisdom, the most famous center of learning in the medieval world, was reduced to ashes. Caliph al-Mustasim was wrapped in a carpet and trampled to death by Mongol horses. For spilling royal blood upon the earth was considered a bad omen. With his death, the Abbasid Caliphate, which had ruled the Islamic world for more than 500 years, came to its end. The devastation did not stop at Baghdad. Hulagu's armies continued their relentless advance westward. Aleppo was taken and sacked in January of 1260. Damascus, the ancient capital of the Umayyads, opened its gates without resistance, terrified by Baghdad's fate. The Mongols had reached the shores of the Mediterranean. For the first time in history, an army from the Asian steppes gazed upon the waters that separated east from west. Only one obstacle remained between them and total domination of the Islamic world: Egypt. Hulagu sent emissaries to the Mamluk Sultan in Cairo, demanding his immediate surrender. The letter was brutal in its clarity. It promised total destruction if Egypt dared to resist. It described in detail what had happened in Baghdad, what awaited them if they refused to submit. It was a tactic that had worked countless times. Terror was the Mongols' most effective weapon. Entire kingdoms had surrendered without fighting simply because of the stories that preceded their armies. But in Cairo, the man who received that letter was different from any ruler the Mongols had ever faced. Saif ad-Din Qutuz had not been born a sultan. He had been born a prince, heir to the Khwarezmian Empire, one of the most powerful kingdoms in Central Asia. But when he was barely a child, the Mongols invaded his homeland. His family was massacred. He himself was captured and sold as a slave in the markets of Damascus. From there, he was taken to Egypt, where he was purchased by a Mamluk commander and trained from childhood in the arts of war. The Mamluks were a unique caste in history, slaves purchased from the steppes of the Black Sea and the Caucasus, transformed into the most formidable military elite of the Islamic world. They were taught to ride before they could walk. They mastered the composite bow, the lance, and the saber. Their discipline was ironclad, their loyalty unbreakable. And although they began as slaves, they could rise to the highest positions of power. Qutuz had risen higher than any. For 2 decades, he served as vice sultan, the power behind the throne. When the Mongol threat became imminent, he deposed the 15-year-old sultan and took command himself. He did not do it out of personal ambition. He did it because he knew that only a strong leader could unite Egypt against the storm that approached. When the Mongol emissaries arrived in Cairo, bearing Hulagu's letter, Qutuz received them in his palace. He listened to their threats in silence. Then, with a calm that froze the blood of his courtiers, he ordered them beheaded. Their heads were impaled on the gates of Bab Zuwayla, one of the main entrances to the city. It was a declaration of war. It was a challenge to the empire that had destroyed everything it touched. It was also a message to his own people. There would be no surrender, there would be no negotiation, only fight or die remained. But Qutuz was not alone. At his side stood a man whose name would resound through the centuries, Baybars. Like Qutuz, Baybars had been born free and had been enslaved by the Mongols. He was a Kipchak from the northern shores of the Black Sea, captured during one of the Mongol raids and sold in the slave markets. Tall, light-eyed, with a distinctive mark in one of them that had earned him the nickname Al-Bundukdari, Baybars possessed a rare combination of ferocity in battle and tactical cunning. He had proven his worth defeating the Crusaders at the Battle of Al-Mansura years before. Now, after years of exile and conflict with the Mamluk court, he had returned to Egypt, reconciled with Qutuz by the common threat. The 2 men who would lead the defense of Islam against the Mongols shared more than military skill. They shared a personal hatred toward the invaders who had destroyed their lives. They shared the memory of massacred families, of lost kingdoms, of a stolen childhood. For them, Ain Jalut would not merely be a battle, it would be revenge. Meanwhile, the situation of the Mongols had changed drastically. In the summer of 1260, news reached Hulagu that would alter the course of history. His brother Mongol Khan, the great Khan of all the Mongols, had died fighting in China. According to Mongol tradition, all princes of the blood had to return to Mongolia to participate in the Kurultai, the assembly that would elect the new great Khan. Hulagu could not ignore this summons. The Mongol throne was at stake, and with it the future of the empire. He departed eastward with most of his army, leaving in Syria barely 1 Tumen, approximately 10,000 soldiers, under the command of his most trusted general, Kitbuka Noyan. Kitbuka was a Nestorian Christian, a veteran of countless campaigns, a commander who had never been defeated in open battle. He trusted completely in the superiority of his troops. After all, the Mongols had crushed armies 10 times the size of his own. What could a few Egyptian slaves do against warriors who had conquered from Korea to Poland? Kitbuka marched south with his men, ravaging the city of Sidon along the way, convinced that Egypt would fall as Baghdad, Aleppo, and Damascus had fallen. He did not know he was marching toward his destruction. In July of 1260, Qutuz gathered his army and departed from Cairo. He would not wait for the Mongols to reach Egypt. He would confront them on neutral ground, in Palestine, before they could threaten the heart of his realm. It was a bold decision, almost reckless. It meant abandoning the safety of Egyptian fortresses and risking everything in a pitched battle against an enemy that had never been defeated. But Qutuz understood something crucial. Terror was the Mongols' main weapon. If Egypt waited behind its walls, fear would seize its people. The only way to win was to attack, to demonstrate that the Mongols could bleed, could fall, could die like any man. The Mamluk army crossed the Sinai and entered Crusader territory. In an extraordinary twist of history, the Christian kingdoms of the Holy Land, traditional enemies of Islam, allowed the Mamluks to pass through their territory unopposed. They even provided them with supplies near Acre. The Crusaders had learned to fear the Mongols as much as the Muslims did. They recognized that if Egypt fell, they would be next. The enemy of my enemy, even if only temporarily, was my ally. Qutuz established his camp near Acre and sent scouts to locate the Mongol army. The information that returned was encouraging. Kitbuka was advancing southward with barely 20,000 men, perhaps fewer. For the first time, the Mamluks would face the Mongols on equal numerical terms. Qutuz summoned his generals and laid out his plan. Baybars would lead the vanguard with his best horsemen. His mission was to provoke the Mongols, to lure them into a trap. The bulk of the army would remain hidden in the hills, waiting for the precise moment to fall upon the enemy. The place chosen for the ambush was a narrow valley near a spring called Ain Jalut, the Spring of Goliath. According to tradition, this was the place where young David had struck down the Philistine giant with a stone from his sling. The irony escaped no one. Once again, on that same ground, the weak would face the powerful. Once again, faith and cunning would be measured against brute force. The morning of September 3rd, 1260, dawned hot and dry. The sun rose over the hills of Galilee, casting long shadows across the Jezreel Valley. At the northern end of the valley, the Mongol army advanced in formation. Their standards fluttered in the morning breeze. The sound of drums marked the rhythm of the march. Kitbuka rode at the front, his armor gleaming in the dawn light. At his side marched veterans of the campaigns of Baghdad and Damascus, men who had seen cities burn and kingdoms fall. Their confidence was absolute. Then, through the dust and the glare of the rising sun, the Mamluk vanguard appeared. Baybars and his horsemen emerged from the hills like ghosts, their white tunics billowing in the wind. They were barely a few hundred, perhaps 1,000. They launched a rain of arrows upon the Mongol lines and then wheeled their horses, retreating southward as if fleeing in panic. It was the oldest tactic in steppe warfare, the feigned retreat. The Mongols had used it countless times against their enemies. But Kitbuka, blinded by contempt for an enemy he considered inferior, did not recognize the trap. He ordered the pursuit. His riders spurred their mounts and charged after the fleeing Mamluks. The Mongol cavalry entered the valley like an unstoppable wave. But the hills that surrounded them were not empty. Qutuz had positioned his men with surgical precision. Archers hidden behind rocks, heavy cavalry waiting. In ravines, infantry prepared to close the trap. He had studied Mongol tactics for years. He knew their strengths, but also their weaknesses. He knew that the Mongols relied on mobility, on the ability to attack and retreat at will. In a narrow valley, surrounded by hostile hills, that mobility would become a prison. When the bulk of the Mongol army entered the valley, Qutuz gave the order. A horn resounded across the hills, and then the valley of Ain Jalut erupted in fire and steel. From the heights, thousands of arrows fell upon the Mongols like a black storm. Horses whinnied and reared. Men fell pierced before they could raise their shields. The Mongol formation, so perfect moments before, began to fragment in chaos. Baybars halted his retreat and wheeled against his pursuers. What had seemed a desperate flight transformed into a devastating counterattack. His horsemen discharged their bows at point-blank range, then drew their sabers and hurled themselves against the enemy lines. The clash was brutal. The sound of metal against metal echoed throughout the valley. Kitbuka tried to reorganize his men. He shouted orders, pointed to positions, tried to form a defensive line. But the terrain worked against him. The slopes flanking the valley prevented any flanking maneuver. The Mongols were trapped in a corridor of death. Then, from the southern end of the valley, the bulk of the Mamluk army appeared. Kutuz rode at the front, his standard flying above him. The war drums thundered like the heartbeat of a giant. The Sultan removed his helmet so his men could see his face. He shouted in Arabic, invoking God, invoking vengeance for Baghdad, for all the Muslims massacred. His voice cut through the roar of battle, and the Mamluks responded with a roar that shook the earth. The battle transformed into a slaughter. The Mongols, for the first time in decades, found themselves outnumbered and outmaneuvered. Their famous harassing and retreat tactics were useless in that narrow valley. There was no room to maneuver, no terrain where they could regroup. The Mamluks pressed them from all flanks, a tide of steel that gave no respite. The heavy Mamluk cavalry struck the Mongol center with devastating force. Their horses, larger and better fed than the steppe ponies, crushed the front lines. Their lances pierced armor that had withstood countless battles. The curved sabers, forged in the finest, smithies of Damascus, cut like wind through grass. It is said that during the combat, the Mamluks employed a weapon the Mongols had never faced: primitive hand cannons, metal tubes that spat fire and smoke. The noise and flames terrified the Mongol horses, sowing more chaos in ranks already shattered. The Mongol formation disintegrated. Small groups of warriors tried to break through toward the north, toward freedom. But the Mamluks pursued them without mercy. There would be no quarter, there would be no prisoners, only blood and vengeance. Kitbuka fought to the end. His personal guard fell around him, one by one, until he stood alone amid a sea of enemies. According to some accounts, he was knocked from his horse and captured alive. They brought him before Kutuz, his hands bound, his face covered in blood and dust. The Mongol general looked at his captor with contempt. When Kutuz reproached him for the innocent blood he had shed, the destruction of Baghdad, the massacre of millions, Kitbuka responded without lowering his gaze. He said that if he died there, he considered it God's will, not his captor's merit. He warned that when Hulagu learned of his death, the ocean of his wrath would boil over, and from Azerbaijan to the gates of Egypt, the earth would tremble beneath the hooves of Mongol horses. Those were his last words. Kutuz ordered his execution. The head of Kitbuka, the undefeated general, was sent to Cairo impaled on a lance. When the sun set over Ain Jalut, the valley was covered with bodies. The Mongol army that had entered that morning convinced of its victory had ceased to exist. Of the 20,000 men who had followed Kitbuka, barely a few hundred escaped toward the north, pursued by Mamluk cavalry for miles. The survivors who managed to reach Syria found a country that no longer belonged to them. Damascus rose against the Mongol occupation as soon as news of the defeat arrived. Aleppo followed shortly after. Within weeks, everything the Mongols had conquered west of the Euphrates was lost. For the first time in 40 years of unstoppable expansion, the Mongol Empire had been permanently repulsed. Previously, they had suffered minor defeats, tactical setbacks that they later avenged with redoubled ferocity. But Ain Jalut was different. They would never recover the lost territory. They would never again threaten Egypt. The frontier of Islam had stabilized, and it would remain so for centuries. Kutuz rode back to Cairo as a hero. News of the victory had spread like fire through dry grass. In every city he passed through, crowds came out to receive him with songs and prayers. Poets composed odes in his honor. The ulema proclaimed him the savior of Islam. But Kutuz's glory would last barely weeks. On the return journey, near the city of Salihiyah, the victorious Sultan was assassinated. The conspirators were Mamluks, his own brothers in arms, and the man who plunged the sword into his neck was Baybars, the same general who had led the vanguard at Ain Jalut. The reasons for the assassination remain disputed by historians. Some say that Baybars expected to receive Aleppo as a reward for his role in the battle, and Qutuz denied him. Others suggest that rivalries between Mamluk factions simply exploded once the common enemy had been defeated. Whatever the motive, Baybars proclaimed himself Sultan that very day. The Mamluks, accustomed to power changing hands through violence, accepted the new leader without resistance. Baybars would rule Egypt and Syria for 17 years, becoming one of the most powerful sultans in Islamic history. He expanded the Mamluk army from 10,000 to 40,000 soldiers. He built fortresses, roads, and communication systems that connected Cairo with Damascus in just 4 days. He expelled the Crusaders from most of their possessions in the Holy Land, and he held off the Mongols, who would try several more times to invade Syria without success. But none of this would have been possible without Ain Jalut, the battle that saved Islam, that halted the Mongol tide, that proved the conquerors of half the world could be vanquished. The impact of Ain Jalut resonated far beyond the Islamic world. In Europe, news of the Mongol defeat was received with relief and astonishment. The Mongols had reached Poland and Hungary barely 2 decades earlier, sowing terror in the heart of the continent. If they had conquered Egypt, they would have controlled the Mediterranean trade routes. They could have attacked Europe from the east and the south simultaneously. The world as we know it could have been radically different. Historians have speculated endlessly about what would have happened if the Mongols had triumphed. Would the Renaissance have existed? The Reformation? The voyages of exploration that connected the continents? These questions have no answers, but they underscore the magnitude of what happened in that valley in Galilee. A battle that lasted barely a few hours changed the destiny of civilizations. In the Islamic world, Ain Jalut became a symbol of resistance and hope. The fall of Baghdad had been a collective trauma of incalculable proportions. The destruction of the House of Wisdom, the death of the Caliph, the massacre of countless scholars and artisans, all of this had plunged Islam into an existential crisis. Many believed that the end times had arrived, that God had abandoned the believers. Ain Jalut demonstrated that resistance was possible, that faith and determination could overcome even the most terrible enemies, that although Baghdad had fallen, the spirit of Islam had not died. Today, more than 760 years later, the valley of Ain Jalut remains calm. The fields where thousands of men fell now produce crops. The spring that gave the battle its name still flows from the earth, indifferent to the blood that once soaked its banks. But for those who know the history, that place remains charged with meaning. There, where legend says David defeated Goliath, another story of the weak against the powerful was written in blood and steel. There, an army of slaves proved that no empire is invincible. There, the course of history turned on its axis, and the world we know began to take shape. Empires rise and fall. Conquests fade with time. But some battles resound through the centuries, reminding us that destiny is never written until the last man falls. Ain Jalut was one of those battles. The day the Mongol legend died, the day the East held back the East, the day history changed forever beside the spring of Goliath.